Do you explain your background and your education, what you have your degrees in?
Yes. So, Jonathan, my background, my educational background started at Harvard College, where I studied art and sculpture and some math. And then I went to Harvard Business School, got my MBA and my doctorate there. And then I went on the faculty, and my thesis was on the economic implications of adopted expert systems, the early AI systems. So I looked and that's what that was about. And then I went on the faculty there for about 12 years, doing a combination of things around digital strategy and AI strategy, and created some courses there, some of the first courses for electronic commerce. And we had students building expert systems back in the 80s. Then I went to a consulting firm that was publicly traded out of Chicago. It was a digital strategy firm. And we had about 500 people, and I was there for a dozen years. I ran thought leadership and served clients and so forth. Served on the board of directors, and we sold ourselves to PricewaterhouseCoopers back in 2010 as part of their build-up. And I stayed there until I hit 60, when you have to retire from Pricewaterhouse. And then since then, I've been doing speaking, writing, board work, and a friend of mine and I started a research company called Gen AI Insights that's aimed at helping people understand and get ethical value from generative artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence. And so we're about 15 months into that new journey.
So when you say value, what type of value are you trying to provide?
Well, we have three constituencies. Our biggest and most important constituency is commercial organizations. So we're helping them try to figure out how to save money, how to get more revenue in, how to develop their people better, how to make more profit, and improve the quality of what they're doing. Then you have, we also serve communities. We do that on a not-for-profit basis. So we're deeply involved in the AI blueprint for Massachusetts, for example. And we've worked with some other locales like Cincinnati and so forth to talk about how do you get the community at large to be better at this. And then we also serve individuals. We have a weekly learning lab that's open to everyone. We have free news that we do 5 days a week. So we really want people to get educated as to what's going on with AI. And our news show takes 6 to 8 articles every day and rates them, are they essential, important, or optional, EIO, in terms of readers. So we really have those three constituencies: firms, communities, and individuals.
Nice. I want to give you some background of myself. I started this podcast because, I was going to get into a PhD in AI, generative AI, big data. Uh-huh. And I wanted to do some research and my idea was that AI would be able to reduce a workforce by around 50%. And this was my first initial thesis.
Sure.
And as I'm doing this, I don't know if that's actually accurate, but, I wanted to see what the effects of long-term were going to be of AI, generative AI, and any of those newer technologies coming up. Not only AI, but what else is coming up. Like, I know we see the Tesla robots coming up, and those are starting to be produced. And when they can be scaled and mass produced, and then you integrate AI, how is that going to impact? So that's my long-term goal, and that's what I wanted to do. And so that's why I started this podcast. And so through your years, what are your biggest changes that you've noticed over the years of your experience?
Well, I think the idea of just how powerful it can be when we can really automate so many things, and to give them, to take the world and put it into a digital format, right? So you can save money, you can have new experiences. I mean, you look at somebody like when you fly in an airplane, the co-pilot, it might be the co-pilot's first time in that physical aircraft, and they've only practiced in a flight simulator, but the flight simulators are so good that they will actually qualify somebody for an aircraft with passengers in it as a co-pilot first time out. So, the power of these things to teach is just fantastic. I think going forward, that's the most important thing, I think, is people understand that these things can be your best tutor for anything, whether it's in your organization or if you're launching a product. Every product's going to have its own little tutor on top of it, your car, your computer, whatever. And you can talk to it in your language, English or French or whatever language. You don't have to talk to it in Python or Java, right? And so that's incredibly profound.
Yeah. So with that, where do you see it going? What are some of the effects you see? And one of the biggest questions I wanted to ask you is, should people be scared of it, or should they push into it and embrace it and try to work it into their workflows?
Yeah, I think people should push into it and embrace it, because the one way to think about it is that, especially generative AI, is like power tools for knowledge work, right? So say you were a carpenter, and you were working on a house, and somebody comes in and sees you there with a hand drill, right, putting a hole in the wall. They'd be like, "What the heck? What's going on?" And anybody who's working with words, images, numbers, or sounds, we wrote an article about this in Harvard Business Review back about a year ago, what we call WINS work. So who would that be? That would be attorneys. That would be kids writing papers for school. That's, somebody doing a contract. That's somebody doing a marketing campaign, right? That's somebody writing a book. That's somebody doing consulting services, right? These are all WINS tasks. If you're doing that stuff and you're not using generative AI, that's like, putting holes in the wall without a power drill, right? It's just nuts. And so it's that's important. I think it's the biggest career accelerant anybody's ever had, because I can do better quality work faster with less stress if I'm using the robots and you're not. And then we're also seeing in the rigorous studies, we're seeing anywhere from 10-15% productivity, all the way through 50% or more in terms of how much a given person can get done.
And with that, what are some of the biggest misconceptions you see? As I have done a lot of my research, I see a lot of people afraid of the AI.
Yeah,
One of the main things I found is a lot of the individuals who are newer to AI, they think AI is this cookie cutter thing, and they don't understand that you have to manipulate it and mold it and train it to be what you want it to be. And when
exactly.
they have these general responses and they are explaining to me, I can tell AI wrote that.
Right.
How do you overcome that barrier? So, two questions: what are the biggest misconceptions, and then how do you come over those barriers of people who are resistant to the AI?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest misconception is this whole thing about, it's going to be like Terminator. It's nothing like Terminator. The this is a network. Think of it more like a beehive, right? But without, not just bees hanging off it, but bees and cockroaches and birds and every other thing, right? Because this is a networked intelligence that has models in it, right? And so I think the analogy is more like a hive mind. Second thing is, people keep talking about, artificial general intelligence. I think that's a fool's errand. Who cares if the machine thinks like I do? Who cares? I don't think it's conscious, and I think there's plenty of evidence that it's not conscious in any human sense. Um, but what can it do? It can think. Just like a bird can fly, but it flies very differently than a plane flies. Machines can think, and they think very differently than the way people think. But they do think, just like a plane flies. You know what I mean? And and the most interesting things about planes is not to try to make them more bird-like; it's to try to figure out how they can be better planes, right? Same thing with this kind of machine thinking. It's not about being more human-like; it's being better machine thinking that interfaces with you. So I think that's a huge thing. I think the last thing is that, just what you started to say, you got to mold it. Like, I think of when I talk to a lot of executives that go and they go up to one of these giant models, GPT-4, Gemini, Anthropic, whatever. Um, I don't know if you've ever seen like a pipe organ in person. They have 62 keys in each keyboard, right? There's three keyboards. They have somewhere between 30 and 40 stops, the things they can pull out. And then they have about 20, a little over 20 pedals down below, right? That's how you should think about a large language model. It's like that, learning to play that thing is really like learning to play a large language model. And most executives go up and they go to the middle keyboard on that giant organ and they play chopsticks with two fingers. And then they come back and they say, not that big a deal. you know, they haven't even begun to play the thing yet. Uh, and in that, look, the most important thing in all that is, think of it as somebody you're talking to or a tutor you're pulling out. Like, the other day, I was going down for some groceries, and I was using Pi, which is from Inflection AI. It's a robot, and So I'm in the car, and it's got a great voice interface. And I just had Pi. I said, could you have Socrates and Nietzsche argue about the meaning of life? And so Pi's there, and Socrates and Nietzsche are arguing about the meaning of life. It's like, these things are amazing.
I started the podcast because I was wanting to see the effects of AI in the workforce. Should people be afraid? Should they not be afraid? What I've come to is you shouldn't be afraid of the AI, but what you should be afraid of is someone who's using the AI better than you. And, essentially what it's become is an extension of a tool that you could use. And obviously that's what it's always been, but that's what I've come to the conclusion it is. But should people be afraid of someone else using the AI and being more effective than them? And how is it going to impact the future of the workforce, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think afraid in the sense of competitively afraid. Not if, I think I'd only be afraid if you've got a bad actor, somebody trying to do something malicious, or you're in a military situation. In a corporate situation, you should be thinking about it like the way you should be paranoid about your competition, right? They're going to be a better competitor than you are, for sure. In terms of what it's going to do with the workforce, I think has a lot to do with what corporations do. If you take a look at the history of automation and industrialization, anytime we have a massive productivity improvement, there's three places that productivity improvement can go. It can go to the end consumer in lower price, right? So you get the same thing for less dough. It can go to the investor in higher returns, economic returns, or it can go to the labor in higher wages. Okay. I'm a believer that if you look back in history, when Henry Ford created the assembly line with a guy named Fred Taylor, who taught him scientific management, that what they did is they put a lot of the money back into the labor. What Henry Ford did is he was willing to pay people $5 a day at a time when the top going wage was $2.50 a day. So he was willing to put a bunch of the surplus that he was making back into the labor. And I think if companies use this to simply take the existing business and drive out labor, then we're going to have lots of unemployed. And I think those companies will not have ongoing economic return. I think if contrary-wise, the companies are willing to reinvest in their people, help them build these models themselves, help them learn how to use this, help them learn how to amplify their careers. I think those companies will have more opportunities for people, and people will be, I think we'll have a better society at large.
Yes, and I agree. And I think I recently interviewed someone who was making the statement that in the future, with the generations as they evolve, what's coming is this younger generation is likely not going to work for organizations without a piece of the business. So he creates this model where he goes into an organization and he trains the leadership to pass down some of the equity in the company to the people, and it has its benefits. That you have long-term sustainment in your organization. You have your workforce who has a vested interest in the success of the overall organization. I think these organizations are going to go with AI. The organizations who aren't investing in their companies and their people are going to be weeded out. But is it the company's responsibility to do that, or do you think it's more of the people's responsibility? Because we have this model where I went through school and the counselors kind of taught me what to do. And I kind of resolved where I wanted to go in my own career on my own because I saw the future of where everything was going. But I don't think a lot of this younger generation understands they need to be molding their career and getting trades now for the future. And so how do we resolve that gap and train the future workforce to work in generative AI?
Yes, well, I think it's back to your question about, is it the responsibility of the organization? I happen to think it is, but even if you don't think it is, I think it's a competitive advantage for the organization to attract talent that can do this. I'll give you one statistic. There was a guy named Bloom who in the early mid-1980s did some research at the University of Chicago. And he showed that people who are tutored as opposed to a traditional classroom, so the old 1 to 30 classroom, right? People who are tutored learn 2 standard deviations better. That means you can take a bad student in a classroom and you can make them better than the best student by tutoring. Okay. And so what these things are is they are massive tutors of any kind. And so, I think that companies need to understand that, because if you and I are competing and your firm has people who are learning 2 standard deviations better than my firm, you're going to win, right? Full stop. You're just going to win. And so business people need to understand that. And then on the other part, Ben Franklin in the United States created the public library. And one of the reasons he created the public library is he thought that in order to have a democracy, you have to have an informed citizenry, right? Or democratic republic, whatever you want to call the United States form of government, right? We need more Ben Franklins. What is the public library of this, right? And I think that it's super important to think through, how do we make sure we have access, we have training, the kinds of things we did in the Industrial Revolution. Like business people supported public education because they needed educated workers to work in the industrial factories. We need to educate people and teach them how to teach themselves with these tools.
I think one of the challenges is that why educate your people in your country and pay them higher if you could just outsource it? And, I think outsourcing and globalization has had a big impact on how that theory of what you just, pushed out there. Because I fully agree with that. And I think it is the responsibility of the organization. I think there's a twofold responsibility. I think it's the responsibility of the organization to people in the organization to kind of give them the opportunity to do it. Now, that person has to have the forward thinking to take that opportunity and grow with it. And, my organization provides a lot of benefits. And within those benefits, I see a lot of people not taking advantage of them because the organization forces you to stay there for X amount of years, which is actually a benefit for you if you think about it in the long term. But, everyone wants immediate gratification. And I think, AI can contribute to that. Like it forces people to want immediate gratification too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of what you just said there. I think the first thing about labor cost advantage going offshore, right? The traditional comparative advantage. Hey, you have cheaper labor than I do, therefore the stuff will move over. Yeah, okay. And then if your people have AI, that's great. They're going to be that much more productive. But I think that there are a lot of things where we've seen it's hard to communicate and reintegrate the work, that small teams working together in intense projects and so forth, it's very hard to outsource that, right? Because we share a common language, we're in the same space, we're as a team, and this was pioneered by a guy named Doug Engelbart, who's the guy who invented the mouse, and he was incredibly important in the personal computer revolution. And his whole thing was, how do you take a group of highly educated professionals who are doing a complex interdependent task, and how do you raise their collective IQ? And outsourcing is not the way to do that, right? I can the more I can chop the work up into little blocks and put it in sequences, I can manufacture it, the more I can do offshore, right? But if I've got anything complex, interdependent, whatever. So that's one thing. The second thing is, it's not clear to me that outsourcers will have the same learning speed that companies who are in the domain will have. So then you say, okay, well, what I'm really trading off is not just the labor cost. If I have somebody who's more expensive, but they can do way more, way faster because they're learning faster and have better tools, well, that's fine. I'll keep that person, right? They're more productive than going over to the less productive, lower cost labor.
I think you're hitting the nail right on the head. And what I think happens is, in a lot of these podcasts and these media sites and et cetera, we can talk through all of those. They go after the clickbait. And one of the ways to do that is through fear. And I think they merge manufacturing and different type of industries. And they don't realize that some of it is intellectual, and you still need that person to person connection, which is why a lot of these organizations are forcing people back to the office.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that the other thing is that I think that there's look we put a lot of subsidies in to make it easier to trade. So Trump and so forth talk about unfair trade practices. Okay, well that's kind of a known thing, and people go back and forth on that. But there are other hidden subsidies, like the U.S. Navy. 90% of the world's goods travel over the ocean, right? And the U.S. Navy is the one that enforces that. The U.S. Navy costs about $300-400 billion a year, right? And if you didn't have the U.S. Navy, all that stuff would be more expensive because they'd have to have their own navies, like they did in the old days. Like the East India Tea Company had its own navy, had its own army, because it had to secure its supply lines, right? And so, I mean, that's what the Boston Tea Party was about, right? That those were the tea they were throwing over was from the East India Tea Company because the king had said you can't buy tea from anyplace else, right? He was enforcing the monopoly of the East India Tea Company. Anyway, so what happens is that we've got all these subsidies that made it easier for people to ship stuff back and forth, right? We also subsidize hydrocarbons because we protect the Saudis, right? There's all kinds of stuff. And so I think that in this world, we don't have to have those subsidies. And so that means that people will be much more comparatively efficient to keep stuff local.
I want to switch the topic a little bit and just talk a little bit more light. What are some of the best use cases that you have seen someone use generative AI?
Yeah, well, no question, customer service, right? There's a ton of people using customer service. There's a company we've written about in the Harvard Business Review. It's called Jerry Insurance. They do car refinancing and car insurance choice. And they have about 5 million customers. And they were able to automate almost 89% from 100% of chat and messaging going to humans. It's down to 11%. They can do it faster, better. The people like it better. They've got an escalation robot. If somebody's getting frustrated, they get to a human right away. And so they think they can serve at least 3 times as many customers with the same number of people, if not more. And the service is better now. So customer service, no question. Second thing, contract reviews, like the ability to review different contracts and capabilities and so forth. That we're seeing that all over the place. There's a company, Blue Cross Blue Shield in Michigan. They work with a company called Quantum Gears out of Newton, Mass. They created a GPT that does contract review. Blue Cross Blue Shield in Michigan buys about $500 million worth of IT. They went in and just reviewed all those different IT contracts and so forth using the contract review tool. They saved over $10 million just looking at the terms and conditions across those many, many contracts. So there's no question about that. Education, tutoring, right? No question. You can see in anything creative, there's a ton of people who are doing it. All of the major advertising companies, like the WPPs of the world and the Young and Rubicoms, right? Their companies are using these for creative design, whether it's copy, whether it's images, whether it's music, right? No question, all that stuff. There's a ton in gaming, right? There's all kinds of generative capabilities on Roblox, for example. There's an amazing amount in biology, right? You look at AlphaFold and its ability to start to do simulations of what molecules might do in the body, right? That's a little longer term. The immediate stuff is, customer service, software programming, massive on software programming, massive on creative, right? Massive on legal and contract review. These are things that are happening now.
I think that's all along that line of what you mentioned earlier, where you're talking through the writing, the math, anything that you can, take down with actually the OCR and image recognition coming through. I think that's going to be evolutionary. And I think, it already is. But, if you're taking your return on your investment and you have a standard deviation of, even if it's 5% and you're getting a higher return, it's a no brainer to integrate some of this AI into what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, that's why we came up with this WINS framework. We said, look at your cost base and say, how much of your cost base is made up of words, images, numbers, and sounds? The creation of or the improvement of words, images, numbers, and sounds. Okay, so if you look at that, and that includes moving images like movies, that includes software, right? Um, if you look at, let's say, I worked at PwC for a while. You look at PricewaterhouseCoopers, their entire P&L is just it's all people who are building words, images, numbers, and sounds, or improving, right? And the other dimension we had is how digitized is it already? Their entire workflow is digitized already. So we said, look, those people are what we call in the crucible, and their business is going to completely change in the next 3 to 5 years. And we wrote this a year ago. And you look now, every single consulting company has a robot. You look at S&P Global, right? And you're interacting with their legal product. You're talking to a generative AI robot. So it's happened even faster than we predicted.
One thing I saw, and I read a study, was those chatbots that you mentioned earlier, as they're integrated into AI. And one of the studies, or excuse me, as they're integrated into the customer service role, what they were finding was that they would do blind studies where it would be either a chatbot and a person. And many times they found that the people who were interacting with the chatbot or the person didn't know, they could not compare the difference. They could not tell the difference between the two. And
Sure.
so when you're that good, and
Yep.
then you have the escalation bot in there, it's a no brainer that it's going to significantly reduce those workloads. So I know you mentioned there's a part where you have education in your company. So
Yes.
how do you educate people, and how would you go about educating those people who are maybe in customer service and trying to reorganize their workforce so that they can still contribute and not lose those people?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing is to see kind of where you are in your journey. Like there's no substitute for people having hands-on experience for this. So we've trained thousands of people inside organizations, and we have a whole seminar we call, generative AI for busy professionals. We have another one for sales. We have different levels of that. So we think that you got to have hands-on experience. That goes all the way to the top of the house, CEO and the board and all that other stuff. They need at least 5, preferably 10 hours of hands-on experience using these models to try to do something that's important to them. So not a trivial thing. And that might be business related. It might be they're planning a vacation. They're trying to choose, a healthcare facility for their elderly parents, or whatever the heck it is, right? They need to interact with these things. So so in training, first thing. Second thing, in terms of how to make it a bit broader capability, and we've just started to do this, and I'm publishing something on this in the Sloan Management Review later this year. That it's Jonathan, we need to think of this thing as the same way we thought about the quality movement in manufacturing. And many people are too young to have experienced that. But what happened in the quality movement is, the in World War II in the United States, when they're building up, aircraft and all that stuff, there was a guy who was a statistical process control guy, and he worked with the War Department to basically help make stuff go up faster, high quality. Then that guy got together with Deming, and when they were rebuilding Japan, when MacArthur was occupying Japan, they brought a lot of the quality stuff over there, right? And that's how the Japanese got so good at quality so early. And then by the time the 1980s rolled around, after World War II, the Japanese were kicking our butt in terms of quality of their products, right? So then the Americans got religion. It's like, oh my God, we taught them how to do it. Now we have to relearn it, right? And so they started a total quality movement. And there's a couple of things from that I think are completely relevant to generative AI. First, what happens is that you've got different levels of expertise. So you got white belts, yellow belts, green belts, black belts, right? And then the way you progress up that is not just knowledge, it's knowledge and skill. You have to show that you applied it. You have to deliver projects, and then you have to teach other people how to do it, right? So those 4 things. So if you want to go from white belt to green belt, you have to deliver projects, program manage some projects, teach other people, show that you have the knowledge, show that you have the skill, okay? All the way up to black. Okay. So that's really important, because not just knowledge is skill. It's not just the technology, but you know how to program management. You have to deliver, right? To a value. Okay. So that's one thing. The second thing is that quality movements, because WINS work, what we call WINS work, this words, images, numbers, and sounds, is everywhere in an organization. And the need for better intelligence is everywhere in an organization, just like quality. You can improve the quality of anything, right? You have to have it with a top-down mandate. Hey, here's the stuff we're looking to get in terms of outcomes. But then bottom-up organization, so the people who really know the work are interacting with the tools and so forth. It's not just going over to the IT department, the vendor, or whatever, because you lose all the value in that translation. So you have to, just like in quality, the people who are doing the work have to be an essential part of driving the improvement. So
Yeah.
those are two really important themes from quality that we need to pick up.
One case study of what you're mentioning, I've actually recently, in my organization, there was a branch that wanted to start automating, and they said, hey, we want to automate actually your job. And instead of having the people who are the experts at that job, automate it, they assigned a new task to someone else to learn our job and then attempt to automate it. I think that's an epic failure. I think you have to have an expert in that field do that. How would you go about creating this automation system and having somebody automate a task that is routinely automatable? And I'm sitting there screaming, you're going to fail. These are some of the things you need to do because this person isn't the expert in it. And how would you go about it?
Yes, well, I think what you have is what you experience. I think is common, and there's two reasons for it. There's the kind of rational reason, which is they don't know the work well enough, and they're trying to specify it, and they need to actually. They'd be much better off having a experienced person in the mix. The other part is there's a phrase I love, which is old age and treachery beats youth and exuberance every time. And so if you're sitting there trying to automate my job and all that other stuff, I can make your life pretty difficult. So, I think the way that I've seen work is you have legitimate involvement of those people. And then, it depends on what kind of organization you are. If you're the kind of organization that, when people are redundant, you give them like the least amount of severance and just boot them out, okay, then you start cutting heads. I'm a believer that people can learn to do new things. And if you help them learn to do new things, they will actually deliver more value for you than you pay them. And
what I've learned in business, so for my background, so you understand, I was 8 years in the Army. And then, I got out of the Army. I finished my degrees while I was in the Army. I did a cybersecurity master's degree from the University of South Florida.
Wonderful.
I'm currently finishing my MBA. I finish it in December, and then I start my doctorate in January, and then I'll go into that.
What's your doctorate in?
It's going to be in automation, AI automation for businesses, how to automate that. I have a narrow niche of what I want to get into, and I'm thinking I might change it just a little bit because of robots or automation. What I wanted to figure out is the merger of the AI with the hardware. So I think, like I mentioned, the robots, but I think there's so many different use cases of it with automobiles. The analogy I like to give is the Walmart case. So, we older generation, I'm 38 now. So, I remember a time where I would go into Walmart and there was lines of people and each line had a person that worked there. Now you go there and they forced you to do it yourself. And we are all trained to go through, and now they reduced that workload from 4 to 1. And what people don't realize is they just implemented technology. And so the extension of that would be AI. So the same goes to, could I automate what I did at my job right now? I 100% could automate it. And I could take a workload of 4 and take it to 1 and reduce the cost. I don't think our organization wants to incur that risk, so they don't do that.
Right.
But that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you said before about, the person who's saying people are going to have to share in the upside, or in the equity of the company, whether it's equity or some other legal form of upside. I agree that, getting people to participate in that surplus, I use, right? Yeah, you want to give some to the customer for competitive advantage, right? So you have a better product at a better price. You want to give some to the investor so that you get capital behind you. But don't forget the labor. For a lot of years, we've forgotten the labor.
I think that might be rebranded. And, I remember when I was doing some research into how the 401k started, that could be another long-term strategy of saying, instead of giving you a severance package or retirement when you retire, we'll give you some equity in the company and then you can sell it back when you go to retire. there's all these different pitches, but
Yes.
the main thesis that this gentleman was talking through was this new generation has a wealth of knowledge and they have more information than anyone that's ever had in the past. And so through that information and through that knowledge, they feel and they have this meaning of I can build a business myself. And it's going to be challenging, but they have the means and they have the opportunity there to do it. So why would I do a job for you when I could do it myself? And so this is this balance of where people are at.
Yeah, I mean the ranks of the self-employed continue to go up, and people who are self-employed on average are happier. I think that the complement to that is the fact that the vast majority of people don't save enough and they don't know how to manage capital, right? And so I'm 67. There are 2/3 of the people my age don't have enough money, period, and they can't live on Social Security. It's not enough, right? And so I think unless you create a society where those people are somehow taken care of, all the entrepreneuring is gonna, you're gonna have to have armored cars, and like it's gonna be like Brazil, right? You're a wealthy person in Brazil, you get your own private security force, and so and that's what a lot of wealthy people in the U.S. take for granted, is that the cost of you holding assets, if you're a very wealthy person in this country, is extremely low. Because if you're anyplace else, you're hiring people, you're paying people off not to steal it, you're doing, you're spending real money, and your kid's going to school, you have a bodyguard, you have an armored, BMW. I mean, that's you're living behind a wall, right? It's not the kind of wall like in Florida, but it's like a real wall with guys with guns and stuff. You know what I mean? And so, it's much more expensive to be wealthy down there in terms of what it does to your life, and we just take that for granted. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't have tons of disenfranchised people. You know, so even if you don't give a hoot about fairness or anything, just in your own life, you want to be in an armored car. You want to be like Mexico City. Is that how you want to live your life? Because that's where you can head if you're not careful.
Yeah. And, there's another part of this podcast of what I started was, the interview part of where I interview people. It's more to gain a knowledge of what's happening with AI, where is it going in the future and the impacts.
Sure.
The second part is I interview AI and kind of see what the AI is saying, see how they're doing. And it's pretty interesting to see some of the biases in it and to see some of the, the way it's trained. One of the things that, and I interviewed on the same topic to see what it comes up with. And one of the things it kept coming up with was universal basic income. And so, I don't know what your stance is on that, but what are your thoughts on that? Because if the workforce is reduced, and we'll just say the overall workforce in the United States is reduced by 25%, that's a large amount of people who are unemployed. And how do we prevent that from becoming a danger to society?
Sure. Yeah. I think that I think it should be a mix of a couple of things. First of all, I like the way that the Australians do superannuation, which is that basically when you're working for somebody, they have to put like 11% away of your wages into something you can't touch until you're old. And we kind of have that with 401ks, but it's too small a number. It needs to be a bigger number, and it needs to be required, I think. Right. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that I think that universal access to healthcare, and I would be for giving an ability to buy into Medicare and Medicaid. I think that's huge because the biggest risk that somebody has financially is their health. And I think what's more important than income inequality is risk inequality. Like, I own my own pension. That's my risk. I own my own healthcare risk. That's a risk. I own the cost of my kids' education. That's another risk. You know what I mean? So I own all these risks that weren't there